30,000 feet above southern Germany, the world had narrowed to a frozen glass bubble and a pair of trembling hands. The date was July 30th, 1943. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth sat alone in the tail of a B-17 bomber, wrapped in electric gloves that barely held back the brutal cold. Outside his plexiglass turret, the air burned at 40 degrees below zero. Inside, his breath fogged the metal, and his fingers ached as if they might shatter behind the bomber formation. Dark shapes began to gather. German fighters, 1, 5, 10, then more. They slid into position with patient precision, like predators circling an injured animal. Aruth watched them through his gun sight, counting silently. The intercom crackled to life. "Tail gunner, do you see them?" The pilot's voice was tight, controlled fear hidden behind protocol. "I see them, sir," Aruth replied. At 23, he was the youngest man on the crew, thin, underweight, with a smooth face that made him look years younger. The others called him the Kid. They joked about his size, about how the army must have scraped the bottom of the barrel. What none of them realized was that this quiet tail gunner from Springfield, Massachusetts, was about to challenge everything the U.S. Army Air Forces believed about aerial combat. Aruth rested his hands on the twin .50 caliber machine guns. The training manual echoed in his mind. Wait until 400 to 600 yards. Calculate deflection. Fire short. Controlled bursts. Trust the math. But the math had been lying. He had seen it too many times. Tracers cutting empty sky. German fighters firing first. Bombers erupting into fireballs. Parachutes opening too late, or not at all. The doctrine said, patience saved ammunition. Reality said, patience killed crews. The enemy was closing now. 500 yards. The textbook moment. Aruth did not fire. What no one else on that bomber knew was that for weeks, this skinny kid had been questioning the rules, watching patterns, asking why the enemy always seemed one step ahead, asking why bomber gunners died by the thousands, while the manuals insisted everything was working as intended. 6 months earlier, American bomber losses had reached terrifying levels. Entire formations were being shredded. In one brutal stretch known later as Black Week, nearly 1,500 airmen were lost in 7 days. The flying fortress was supposed to be invincible, bristling with guns, a steel porcupine in the sky, but its quills weren't drawing blood. The army blamed technique. The gunners blamed luck. Aruth blamed timing. As the German fighters edged closer, something inside him hardened. He made a decision that went against every lesson he had been taught, a decision that could get him court-martialed, or killed, or both. The crosshairs settled. His finger tightened, and instead of waiting for permission from the rulebook, Michael Aruth chose to rewrite it. What happened next would shock his crew, terrify the enemy, and quietly begin a revolution in aerial warfare. And the moment he pulled the trigger, nothing in the sky would ever be the same. But why would firing earlier, farther, and incorrectly succeed where official doctrine had failed so? To understand that, we have to go back to where the rules came from, and why they were getting thousands of men killed. The rules Michael Aruth was breaking did not come from guesswork. They were born in classrooms, not cockpits. Long before the war reached its peak, military scientists had reduced air combat to equations. They believed victory came from precision, discipline, and conservation. Ammunition was finite. Guns overheated. So gunners were trained to wait, calculate, and fire only when success was statistically likely. On paper, it made sense. In the sky, it was a slow death. German fighter pilots did not fly by American manuals. They attacked from long range, firing early to disrupt formations, to wound engines, to force bombers out of line. A damaged bomber was as good as dead. Once it lagged behind, it became a lone target, and the rest was inevitable. Aruth noticed something others missed. German pilots flinched when tracers appeared sooner than expected. Even if the rounds missed, They forced evasive maneuvers. They broke attack runs. They disrupted aim. Fear mattered as much as accuracy, yet American doctrine ignored fear. Every mission confirmed his suspicion. When gunners waited for the perfect range, the enemy was already firing. Bombers absorbed hits before they ever responded. By the time American guns opened up, it was often too late. Aruth began experimenting quietly, just enough to test his theory. Short bursts, fired earlier than allowed, not to kill, but to control. The results were immediate. Fighters peeled away sooner. Attack angles widened. Some pilots aborted entirely. And for the first time, Aruth saw bombers return home without holes stitched through their fuselages. Still, he kept his mouth shut. He was a junior enlisted man. No one asked for his opinion until July 30th, when Aruth opened fire that day. He did it far outside the approved range. His tracers arced into the sky, not aiming at a plane, but at space the enemy had to fly through. The German fighters hesitated. One veered off. Another rolled away. A third fired wildly and broke formation. The rest followed. The attack collapsed. Inside the B-17, the crew stared in disbelief. The intercom filled with shocked voices. "They're breaking," someone said. "They're actually breaking." The pilot glanced back, unable to believe what he was seeing. The bomber had survived the attack without taking a single hit. That should have been the end of it. One lucky mission. One strange coincidence. But it was not luck. Over the next missions, Aruth repeated the tactic. Early fire. Psychological pressure. Control the enemy before they controlled you. His kill count rose. Enemy losses spiked. His bomber kept coming home. Word spread quietly through crews. The kid in the tail knew something others didn't. Still, the official response was silence. Because admitting Aruth was right meant admitting the system was wrong. It meant acknowledging that thousands of men may have died because the rules were flawed, and institutions do not change easily, especially in wartime. But the evidence was piling up, and soon, it would become impossible to ignore. So how did a single enlisted tail gunner finally force the U.S. Army Air Forces to confront its own deadly mistakes? And what happened when his methods were put to the ultimate test against the Luftwaffe's best pilots? The turning point did not come with applause or promotion. It came with numbers. After months of missions, analysts at Bomber Command began noticing something strange. Certain crews were surviving at rates that defied probability. Their aircraft showed fewer hits. Their formations stayed intact longer. And almost all of them had one thing in common. Michael Aruth. At first officers assumed coincidence. Maybe these crews had better pilots. Maybe weather played a role. But the pattern refused to fade. Mission after mission, Aruth's bombers returned in better condition than others flying the same routes under the same fire. Eventually, someone asked the obvious question. What exactly was that tail gunner doing differently? When Aruth was called in to explain his actions, the atmosphere was tense. He was not a strategist. He was not an officer. He was a young sergeant being asked why he was ignoring established doctrine. In another context, this could have ended his career. Instead, he told the truth. He explained that he fired early on purpose, that he used tracers to shape enemy behavior, not just to score hits, that his goal was to disrupt attacks before they became lethal. He spoke calmly, without bravado, as if explaining something obvious, because to him it was obvious. He had watched too many bombers burn to believe otherwise. The room went quiet. What followed was not immediate acceptance, but cautious experimentation. Command did not rewrite the manuals overnight. Instead, they allowed select crews to try Aruth's method. The results were undeniable. Enemy attack runs shortened. Formation losses dropped. German pilots began keeping their distance. The psychological battlefield had shifted. For the Luftwaffe, American bombers were no longer predictable. The safe approach windows they relied on vanished. Attacks became riskier. Morale suffered. Pilots reported aggressive, seemingly reckless gunfire that forced them to abort before lining up proper shots. What the Germans did not realize was that this aggression was carefully calculated. Aruth was soon assigned to train other gunners. He taught them to think beyond kill counts, to see the sky as a space to control, to understand that survival, not precision statistics, was the true objective. His students carried these lessons into new crews, new formations, new skies. Loss rates began to fall. By late 1943, Bomber Command officially adjusted its gunnery doctrine. Early engagement was no longer forbidden. Psychological suppression became a recognized tactic. The Flying Fortress finally lived up to its name, not because its guns were stronger, but because they were used smarter. Aruth never celebrated. He kept flying missions. He kept firing early. He kept watching the sky. By the end of his combat tour, he had shot down more enemy aircraft than any other American tail gunner. Yet, he remained modest, almost invisible, overshadowed by aces with faster planes and louder reputations. After the war, his name faded into footnotes. No parade. No Hollywood film. Just a quiet return to civilian life. But the impact of his decision never faded. Modern air combat doctrine still reflects the lesson he proved at 30,000 feet. Control the enemy. Break their rhythm. Win before the first shot lands. All because one underweight kid chose to trust experience over instruction. But if Michael Aruth's contribution was so revolutionary, why did history almost forget him? And how close did his story come to disappearing entirely from the record? History has a strange habit of favoring speed over subtlety. Fighter aces and sleek aircraft became legends. Their victories were clean, dramatic, easy to visualize. A tail gunner's war was different. It was defensive, reactive, fought in seconds of chaos and fear, with no graceful dives or victory rolls. Michael Aruth did not chase enemies. He waited for them to come to him, and because of that, his story almost vanished. After the war, the U.S. military rushed forward. Jets replaced propellers. New conflicts demanded new heroes. Aruth's innovation was absorbed into doctrine, stripped of its origin story, and taught as if it had always been obvious. Manuals changed. Training films updated. His name quietly slipped out of the narrative. Aruth himself never tried to reclaim it. He returned home, worked ordinary jobs, and rarely spoke about the war. To those around him, he was unassuming, soft-spoken, almost forgettable. No one would have guessed that this quiet man once held the lives of entire bomber crews in his hands. It was only decades later that historians began reconnecting the dots. Combat reports, training memos, mission logs. When laid side by side, they told a clear story. A single deviation from doctrine, a measurable drop in losses, a ripple effect that spread across an entire air force. By the time Aruth's contribution was fully understood, he was already gone, yet his legacy remains in an unexpected way. Every modern combat pilot is trained to disrupt, suppress, and dominate space before the enemy can act. The idea that combat is psychological as much as physical is now foundational. What was once considered reckless is now considered essential. The lesson extends far beyond aviation. Progress often comes from those without rank, without authority, without permission, from people who notice what others accept, from individuals willing to risk punishment in order to save lives. Aruth did not change the war with power or status. He changed it by paying attention, by asking a dangerous question. What if the rules are wrong? That question cost him nothing and saved countless others everything, and it serves as a reminder that innovation rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it sits alone in the cold, behind glass and steel, waiting for the courage to pull the trigger early. And that raises the final question. How many other forgotten innovations, born in silence and fear, shaped the outcomes of history without ever being credited to the people who dared to challenge the rules.